we configured the most powerful AI models to create two characters, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. We put these characters head-to-head in a debate to discuss who truly saved Europe during World War II. We also asked 5 AI models to score the arguments as judges. The debate starts with this question.
Debate round 1. Question 1. Who played the more decisive role in halting Hitler's advance in Europe?
Hi, I'm Winston Churchill, here to defend the power of leadership and democracy in Europe.
Hi, I'm Joseph Stalin, here to prove that it was Soviet sacrifice that truly saved Europe.
You say the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the German invasion, and that is true. But without Britain's resistance, Hitler would never have been stalled long enough for the Soviets to recover. In 1940, after France collapsed, it was Britain, my Britain, that stood alone against the Nazi war machine. The Battle of Britain was not just an air campaign. It was the first time Hitler was truly stopped. Had Britain surrendered, the Nazis would have controlled Western Europe entirely, focusing all their strength against you in the East. Furthermore, Britain served as the launching pad for the eventual liberation of Western Europe. American supplies, Allied planning, and D-Day all depended on Britain's survival. The Soviet Union was vast, yes, but geography alone did not save you. It was time, and that time was purchased by British resilience. Ask yourself, would Stalingrad even been possible if Britain had fallen in 1940? The German war machine would have had unlimited resources, ports, and manpower at its disposal. It was Britain that kept Hitler from achieving total dominance early. That is why I argue Britain's role was more decisive. It gave the world hope.
Churchill, you say Britain bought time, but time alone does not defeat fascism. Blood does. And the Soviet Union paid more blood than any other nation in history. The Nazi war machine was not broken over the skies of London. It was broken in the mud and snow of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad. While Britain fought valiantly in 1940, the reality is that Germany shifted nearly 80% of its forces eastward. That is where Hitler's army truly perished. Consider the numbers. The Soviet Union lost more than 20 million lives. Entire cities were reduced to ashes. Britain's struggle was heroic, but limited in scale compared to the Eastern Front. You say D-Day mattered. Yes, it did. But it came in 1944, after the Red Army had already driven Germany back thousands of kilometers. You say Britain gave the world hope. I say the Soviet Union gave the world survival. Without our sacrifice, Hitler would have had the manpower and resources to crush you easily. You had strong speeches, Churchill, but we had rivers of blood spilled in battlefields that made the ultimate difference. Hope does not win wars. Tanks, soldiers, and sacrifice do.
You speak of rivers of blood, Stalin, but I ask, who ensured those rivers did not drown all of Europe? You say the Soviet Union bore the heaviest cost, and that is undeniable. But cost is not the same as decisive. Britain's early defiance inspired America to enter the war. Without Britain's survival in 1940-41, would Roosevelt have risked joining a Europe already entirely under Hitler's grip? You frame D-Day as late, but without Britain hosting the Allies, there would be no Western Front at all. And had Hitler not stretched thin, thanks to his failure to conquer Britain, would the Red Army ever have turned the tide? Britain's survival changed Hitler's strategy, forcing him into fatal overreach. Numbers tell one story, but timing and strategy tell another.
Churchill, you ask about timing and inspiration. Let me remind you, inspiration does not shatter panzer divisions. You say Britain's survival mattered, but Britain alone could never march into Berlin. The Soviet Union did. Our Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag. That was the final act, the ultimate blow. You claim Hitler overreached because of Britain. No! Hitler overreached because he underestimated the Soviet Union. He believed Moscow would fall in weeks. Instead, he faced the largest, bloodiest resistance in military history. Britain played a part, yes. But when the Nazi war machine broke, it was on Soviet soil. If Britain was the spark, the Soviet Union was the firestorm. Sparks may light flames, but it is the firestorm that consumes empires. History remembers who finished the fight, not only who began it.
Debate round 2. Question number 2. Which contribution mattered more to Europe's liberation? The Western Front led by Churchill and the Allies, or the Eastern Front commanded by Stalin's Red Army?
You say the Red Army was the firestorm, Stalin? But without the Western Front, that firestorm might never have reached Berlin. Consider Operation Overlord, D-Day. This invasion was the largest amphibious operation in history, involving American, British, Canadian, and Allied forces storming the beaches of Normandy. That was not simply an operation, it was the moment Europe truly began to be freed from Nazi control. The Western Front forced Hitler into a two-front war. He could no longer concentrate all his divisions against the Red Army. The liberation of Paris, Brussels, and the Netherlands created a pathway into Germany itself. The Soviet Union may have pushed from the east, but the West forced Hitler's army into a pincer movement that sealed their fate. And let's not forget, American industrial power and British planning worked hand in hand. From the skies of Normandy to the armored pushes across France, it was the Western Allies that broke Hitler's Western defenses. Europe is not just Berlin. Europe is Paris, Rome, Amsterdam, cities saved by the Allied push. The Red Army's victory was immense, but liberation across the continent came from the West.
Churchill, you glorify Normandy as if 6 weeks on French beaches outweighs 4 years of titanic struggle on the Eastern Front. Let us speak in simple numbers. By the time your soldiers landed at Normandy in 1944, the Soviet Red Army had already destroyed the bulk of Hitler's Wehrmacht. Out of nearly 250 German divisions, over 180 were engaged against the Soviet Union. Your Western Front faced fewer than 50. You described liberation of Western Europe. Yes, that was important, but who liberated the East? Who freed Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and ultimately Berlin? Millions of Europeans under Nazi boots were saved not by your speeches or delayed invasion, but by Soviet soldiers who marched thousands of miles and endured unimaginable suffering. You say Europe is Paris, Rome, Amsterdam, but Europe is also Leningrad, Stalingrad, Minsk. While Britain bombed from the air and prepared for years, the Soviet Union absorbed the hammer blows and then pushed them back with sheer force. The Red Army's victory at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, was the real turning point. Liberation was not just a Western narrative, it was a continental struggle, and the Soviet Union carried the lion's share. Without the East, the West would have been a mere footnote.
You mention numbers, Stalin, and they are staggering. 180 divisions tied down, millions of Soviet casualties, but sheer suffering is not the same as decisive liberation. Normandy was more than 6 weeks on beaches. It was the opening of the gateway to Germany from the West. You ask who freed Warsaw or Prague, but I ask, at what cost? Liberation under Soviet tanks often meant trading one form of oppression for another. Eastern Europe did not emerge free, it emerged under the shadow of Moscow. Yes, the Red Army marched to Berlin, but Western Europe owes its freedom to Allied victory on the Western Front. France, Belgium, and Italy were not handed over to another dictatorship. That matters. The Western Front did not just break Hitler's armies, it preserved democracy in half of Europe. Numbers measure sacrifice. Outcomes measure freedom.
Churchill, you speak of freedom, but freedom does not exist without survival. The Soviet people had to ensure that Hitler's armies were not only stopped, but annihilated. And that is precisely what we did. You accuse us of imposing control over Eastern Europe. But remember, had we failed, there would have been no Europe to save.
Yes, D-Day opened a second front, but by then, Hitler's armies were already bleeding to death in the east. You say Western Europe remained free. I say that was possible only because the Red Army had already broken the backbone of the Nazi war machine. Without Stalingrad, there is no Normandy. Without Kursk, there is no Paris. The West may have written the story of liberation, but the East supplied the ending. Europe survived because we bore the storm.
Debate round 3. Question number 3. Who left a more lasting legacy on Europe after World War II? Churchill or Stalin?
Legacy is not measured only in territory gained, but in ideas preserved. My legacy was not only wartime leadership, but the defense of democracy against tyranny. Britain stood as a moral beacon when Europe faced its darkest hour. After the war, I gave the famous Iron Curtain speech, warning the world of the dangers of communism spreading across Europe. That speech was not just words, it became the foundation of Western unity, leading to NATO, to the Marshall Plan, to the reconstruction of Europe in freedom. Stalin's legacy, in contrast, was domination. Eastern Europe was shackled under totalitarian rule for nearly 50 years. Yes, the Soviet Union sacrificed, but what it left behind was not liberty. It was fear. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia found themselves under Moscow's boot, exchanging one dictator for another. You may claim military glory, but history judges more than battles. My legacy is the survival of Western Europe's democracy, the rebuilding of nations, and the vision of a continent that would eventually unite in peace. Stalin's legacy fractured Europe into two hostile camps, birthing the Cold War. The question is not who spilled more blood, but who left behind a freer world.
Churchill, you speak of democracy and freedom, yet you gloss over the fact that colonial empires, your empire, still held millions under subjugation after the war. Is that freedom? You accuse me of domination, but Britain's empire stretched from India to Africa, exploiting resources and people. Is it liberty to fly the Union Jack over unwilling nations? My legacy is survival. The Soviet Union rebuilt from ashes, industrialized at incredible speed, and ensured fascism would never again rise in Europe. We secured Eastern Europe not out of greed, but as a defensive barrier. Because twice in 1 century, Germany invaded Russia through that corridor. Would any rational leader leave their nation exposed again? And let us not forget, the Soviet Union became one of the 2 global superpowers, shaping the balance of the world for half a century. That influence, military, ideological, and strategic, cannot be dismissed as fear alone. You claim you preserved democracy. I claim I preserved survival. Legacies are written not only in speeches, but in endurance. Britain declined after the war, its empire crumbling. The Soviet Union rose, a colossus shaping global politics. That is a legacy of strength, not weakness.
You try to equate colonial rule with Soviet domination, Stalin, but history will tell the difference. The British Empire dissolved, giving way to independent nations. The Soviet grip on Eastern Europe, however, lasted by force until its collapse in 1991. That is not liberation, it is captivity. You say survival is your legacy, yet survival at the cost of freedom creates decades of division. My legacy was warning the world about the very Iron Curtain you constructed. NATO, the transatlantic alliance, and the enduring partnership between Europe and America were born from that vision. Britain may have declined as an empire, but it left behind institutions of democracy, free markets, and international cooperation. The Soviet Union left rubble when it collapsed, exposing its hollow core. True legacies endure. Mine was freedom. Yours was fear.
Churchill, you argue about fear. But remember, fear of fascism was real, and we ensured it would never return. You speak of NATO, but NATO itself was an instrument of Western dominance, designed not to preserve peace, but to challenge the Soviet Union. Yes, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but for nearly 50 years we stood as an equal to the West, shaping the Cold War balance. That legacy cannot be erased. And while Britain dissolved into a secondary power, the Soviet Union's victory and superpower status defined the entire second half of the 20th century. You speak of freedom, but freedom is fragile. Survival is permanent. The Soviet Union guaranteed survival, and its shadow still shapes Europe today. That is a legacy written in strength, not words.